I'm Seokyong Jung from Hanyang University, and this is my first conference paper, and it is awfully accepted best 19, so I'm quite nervous at the moment and maybe prone to misunderstand your question. And at the end of this talk, if you have questions, it would be great if you hold your questions and take it to offline, especially at the poster session where I will be standing at this evening. Okay, today I'm going to present our paper, PayGo, that is designed to address issues in reference counting for modern multicore machine. And this is joint work with 4 co-authors. Reference counting is a general scheme developed almost 6 decades ago to manage the number of references for resources being used and to check whether they are used or not. So it is mainly used to reclaim resources in timely manner. Also, as the multicore hardware becomes widespread, the scalability is the most important issue in designing the reference counting scheme. Let's look at the known scalability issue of reference counting implemented in the Linux page cache on which all existing file systems rely. Since Linux file systems use an atomic reference counter, it shows a huge contention under workloads accessing the same reference counters again and again. As shown in the figure, this was presented in ATC 2016. Before we move on to the main idea of PayGo, we established 4 important criteria essential to designing better counting schemes. The first metric is the counting overhead, which is the most important one. And the counting overhead specifies the cost for updating a reference counter. The next one is the query overhead, which specifies the cost for checking if a reference counter is 0 or not. The third one is a space overhead, which is the space required for reference counter itself. The last one is a time overhead, that is time needed for synchronizing between internal structures for reference counting. As you can see in this figure, the ideal scheme should have a low overhead in all directions. Using the 4 overhead metrics, we analyzed the prior proposals. And the first one is traditional reference counting. Since the traditional reference counting uses a single atomic counter, it shows a low query overhead, and low space overhead, and low time overhead. But the problem is, if there are a lot of processes containing the same reference counter, the performance almost collapses. And this is depicted in the left-hand side of the slide. Next, we analyze the schemes developed based on the contention distribution. The contention distribution is basically dispersing the contention overhead to multiple reference counters. Since it uses multiple reference counters, it shows worse space overhead and worse query overhead. But it actually achieves a better counting overhead. And this is clearly depicted in the figure, and schemes belonging to this category are shown below. Next one is schemes developed based on a cache affinity. And cache affinity-based schemes are developed to minimize the cache misses. And this is done by maintaining the reference counter per each core. So the cache affinity-based schemes basically achieve better counting overhead. The problem is, since it maintains per core reference counter, it shows worse space overhead and worse query overhead. And this is shown in the figure. Prior work belonging to this category is shown below, and it is implemented in Linux device drivers. The last and the most recent work we analyzed is based on a per-core hash-based scheme. Per-core hash-based scheme is designed to reduce the space overhead without sacrificing the counting scalability. To this end, the per-core hash-based scheme basically uses fixed-size per-core hash tables for reference counting. As you see in this slide, each core maintains a fixed size of hash of local reference caches. And the processes running on a core only access to the local reference cache in the hash. When a process accesses a local reference cache, it does not use atomic operations, so it achieves better counting scalability. But the issue in per-core hash-based schemes is when to synchronize the local reference caches to the global one. And this is typically done by flushing local reference caches to the global one periodically. And that causes time delay. So in summary, the per-core hash-based schemes achieve better counting overhead, but worse security overhead and the worst time overhead. And this is illustrated in the slide, and prior proposals are shown below. The story for per-core hash-based schemes goes well as long as the workload accesses a few number of reference counters. However, if we run workload that accesses a large number of objects that may populate the entire hash, then we face another problem. Since per-core hash-based schemes periodically flush the local reference caches to the global one, if a hash table lacks available entries, you may need to trigger the forceful evictions that internally evict some other entries by forcibly flushing the entries to the global one. So in summary, the time delay required for flushing local reference caches to the global one in per-core hash-based schemes incurs another side effect when it runs workload that accesses a large number of objects. Since the forceful eviction is executed by acquiring a mutex, it sacrifices the counting scalability. And this is clearly illustrated in here. To confirm this, we conducted a preliminary experiment that measured the throughput of ref cache for page caches. As you can see in the result, the throughput of ref cache degrades as we increase the number of shared objects, mainly because of the forceful eviction. Summarizing all these different schemes shows different characteristics, and we found that there are two different trade-offs. The first one is a counting query trade-off, and the second one is a space-time trade-off. And resolving the counting query trade-off is beyond the scope of this paper, and we focus on resolving the space-time trade-off. Okay, let's look deeper inside the schemes to understand the core challenges to address the space-time trade-off. Let me explain the core challenges by comparing the cache affinity-based and the per-core hash-based schemes. The main question we have to ask is, why can we reduce both the space and time overheads? Here what you can see is, in cache affinity-based schemes, they allocate per-core counters. So basically, they use quite large amount of memory if there are a lot of live objects. But there is no need to worry about the time delay for reclaiming the local reference caches. So cache affinity-based schemes earn low time overhead in exchange for high space overhead. And that's why we couldn't see many use cases in Linux, even if there are available cache affinity-based schemes implemented in Linux operating system. In contrast, per-core hash-based schemes reduces the space overhead by allocating a fixed size hash table of local reference caches in exchange for high time delay required for flushing local reference caches to the global one. However, the per-core hash-based schemes inevitably face another problem, which is if we run per-core hash-based scheme under workload that accesses high number of live objects, then it is necessary to evict some other obsolete objects from the hash table. The main issue in evicting the obsolete entries from the hash table is we must figure out when it is safe time to evict entries from the hash table. In the existing scheme, we have two viable options. The first option we have is we have to wait until flushing the hash entries is completed, which is basically we have to wait until 2 epochs have passed. But that typically causes 20 or 40 millisecond delay. The second option we have is we should execute the burst-free evictions. So the burst-free eviction may affect running processes accessing the concerned per-core hash. It should involve the use of the mutual exclusion method. That is typically implemented by using a mutex, and it incurs another contention overhead, and it degrades the performance. And this is the side effect we presented in the previous slide. The main idea of our approach to this issue is to make a local reference cache 0 if there are no other processes holding all references to the object. Thereby reclaiming 0-valued reference cache can be done instantly. To this end, if a process increments a reference counter in a local reference cache, then it actually creates the anchor. So basically, it means the process is anchored to the original reference counter it has incremented. No matter where it goes, it always has to decrement the anchored reference cache. This indeed makes the local reference cache 0 if there are no other references alive. To realize our design, each local reference cache entry has 2 different counters. One is a local counter, which is only accessed by a process who is currently running on the core. And the other one is an anchor counter, which is accessed by processes migrated to other cores. The mutual exclusion for local reference counter is guaranteed by disabling preemption. When a process decrements the reference cache it has incremented, if it stays on the same core, then it decrements the local counter of the original reference cache without using the atomic instruction. So accessing the local counter is best and safe. In the meantime, the mutual exclusion for the anchor counter is guaranteed by using atomic instruction. The overhead of atomic instruction on the anchor counter arises only if process migration occurs. The reason why we use atomic instruction is to ensure the mutual exclusion between migrated processes all accessing the same reference cache. So if you stay at home, then there is no tax you have to pay. Otherwise, if you migrated to other core, then that's the time you have to pay migration tax, which executes atomic instruction. And this is how we got the name PayGo, which is pay migration tax to Homeland. Here we explain why we use 2 different counters for a single object in local reference hash in PayGo. As you can see in the slide, here we only use one single local reference counter. Suppose we have two threads. The first one is a red one, and the other one is blue one. So red one increments the counter, and the blue one also increments the counter from 0 to 1. And then in the next stage, the red one decrements the counter from 1 to 0. But at this time, the green one is newly created. And it migrates to the core 3, and the blue one running on the core 1 is also migrated to the core 2. And the yellow one is newly created in the next stage. Okay, at this time, the three threads access the same local reference counter. When yellow one tries to increment the local reference counter, both the blue and green tries to decrement the local reference counter. At this time, if they don't use the atomic instruction, the race occurs, and we don't guarantee which value will be the binary. To avoid having data race on the local reference counter, a process always has to use atomic instruction to access the reference counter, regardless of the type of core it is currently running on. So in summary, if you use a single local counter per each hash entry, either you have to flush the local reference hash to the global one, or you have to use atomic instruction. The former incurs the time delay, and the latter incurs contention overhead, which degrade performance. Now we understand why we need two counters for each object. Next, we explain how the anchor counter is used. Suppose we have two different threads. The first one is red one, and the other one is blue one. And when red and blue access the local reference counter, they increment the counter using non-atomic instructions. Once blue thread increments the local reference counter using non-atomic instruction, it is migrated to the core 2. In the next stage, the red one decrements the counter from 1 to 0 using non-atomic instruction, and at this time, green one is newly created, and it increments the counter from 1 to 2. And then it is migrated to the core 3. In the next stage, the yellow one is newly created, and it increments the counter from 2 to 3. At this time, the blue and green, who are accessing the same reference counter, want to decrement the counter. Since blue and green are migrated from the original anchor core, which is core 1, to the core 2 or core 3, they have to use the atomic instruction to decrement the counter. And the counter they have to access is not the local counter, but the anchor counter. Since they use atomic instruction to decrement the anchor counter, the summation of the local counter and associated with the anchor counter will be correct. The benefits of PayGo can be summarized as follows. The first, it has low counting overhead, since it allows the local processes access the local counter using non-atomic instruction. The second, it has low space overhead because we only maintain per core hash. Despite these advantages, PayGo still has high query overhead, but escaping the counting query tradeoff is actually beyond the scope of this work. Summarizing all the characteristics of the PayGo into our radar chart, then PayGo has a better counting scalability. But the query overhead of PayGo is worse than traditional scheme, since it has to read all of the local counts from the local reference caches. However, the anchoring scheme in PayGo can mitigate the query overhead of PayGo. Since PayGo never miscounts the local references in a local reference cache, the summation of local and anchor counters in a core can never become negative during the zero detection. Whence, if any process has a positive local count, we can immediately stop zero detection safely. In terms of space overhead, PayGo is similar to left cache, since it uses per core hash. Lastly, in terms of time overhead, PayGo doesn't have time delay due to anchoring scheme. Here we show data structures required for implementing PayGo in Linux. First, we have per core hash of local reference caches, and each entry of the hash consists of object pointer, local counter, and anchor counter. In order for a process to manage the anchor core information, a task struct has a list of anchor core IDs, and every time a process references an object, it stores core IDs in that list. All the explanations up to now are about kernel-level PayGo design. We know that there are plenty of opportunities that PayGo can contribute to enhance the performance of user-level reference counting. To support reference counting for user-level objects, we export two system cores to applications. We implemented sysref and sysunref system cores to user applications, which internally wrap the core kernel-level PayGo operations. The reason we wrap the core kernel-level PayGo functions is disabling and enabling the preemption cannot be controlled by applications for the safety reason. So, although processes have mode switch overhead, the system cores enable reference counting on user-level objects with far better scalability than legacy counting techniques. With far better scalability than legacy counting schemes. So far, we have presented our reference counting scheme, PayGo. The remaining slides will show experimental results that evaluated existing reference counting schemes, including PayGo, in Linux on our 96-core server machine. To evaluate the performance of file operations under strongly contending scenarios and weakly contending scenarios, we ran the shared block read workload intended to stress file systems and random read workload to disperse contention on the reference counters. PayGo and refcache perfectly scaled the throughput under strongly contending workloads. However, on weakly contending workloads, as the thread count increases, the throughput gap between PayGo and refcache widens, which were not observed under strongly contending workloads. We further investigated the performance spectrum over different contention levels to fully understand the nature of the space-time trade-off. For this evaluation, we used a micro benchmark that 96 threads perform sequential reads for every page on a single file, whose size is varied from 1 megabyte to 64 megabyte with ext4 mounted. The most noticeable result is the sharp throughput decreases in refcache as the file size grows, which clearly shows the negative effect of a large time overhead to scalability. PayGo effectively addresses the problem and underwent no performance overhead for that issue. Next, we evaluated the performance of user-level PayGo system calls to see its applicability. For the evaluation, we used the micro benchmark that has a varying number of threads referencing and unreferencing user-level objects repeatedly. For comparison, we implemented two methods using atomic batch and add and compare and swap instructions. The performance of two methods were either saturated or slowly degrading. Meanwhile, while our user-level PayGo scaled the performance with no contention overhead, regardless of the count of objects, even though there is the mode switch overhead. In conclusion, we analyzed the overheads for the existing reference counting schemes, including PayGo, and depicted the results in a radar chart showing their trade-offs. PayGo efficiently reduces the time overhead by using our anchoring scheme. Its counting scalability was attractive in evaluation compared to existing schemes. This is the last slide for PayGo, and I'd appreciate if any questions, but simple one. Thank you.
Let's see. I'll start with one question.
Yeah.
So, one question I had on this is it safe to read the dual counters from other cores?
It's safe. No, it is not safe because in the slide, we can use the other process on the other. If one thread increase the local thread, the other threads on the other cores can decrement the counter. So it's not safe to updating and read the counter value.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's thank the speaker again.